Ali's a familiar face to us all here. I was really glad that he submitted an abstract because I remember an extraordinarily brilliant intellectual delivery he made in one of our forums back in, I think it was Gower Street days, and he's going to be talking about public law as an act of dissent. So welcome to the stage, Ali.
No, I'm limited to 20 minutes, so I'm going to have to press forward. Are we affiliated to a university or merely a trade school? Can we have the next slide, please? Oh, no, it's me. I need to. Okay, I thought. Okay, right. So, how do we really identify ourselves? Are we educators, as Professor Twining once said, here to educate Pericles, or are we merely just training plumbers? What is our identity? What is our institutional identity? What is it that we want to do? If the institution is a glorified trade school, we as educators must resist the temptation to conform and just train the plumber, or the second-rate solicitor sitting in the back offices of a second-rate high street firm. We must allow them to aim higher. And if allowing them to aim higher, working for them to aim higher means resisting what is imposed on us institutionally, then to the extent that we can resist, we must resist. Just last month, Michael Higgins, a sociology professor from the Republic of Ireland, who today also happens to be president of Ireland, lamented in a speech the changes to higher education happening across Europe in the name of market forces. He talked of utilitarian reductionism in the teaching and learning process. What does utilitarian reductionism mean? Basically, it's a concerted drive towards sacrificing the process of education in order to reduce teaching to box ticking of learning objectives. Have I taught this? Yes, I have. Fine, let's move on. Did I say that? Yes, I did. Fine, let's move on. You can tick boxes and hope that you've trained the plumber, but you can't tick boxes and educate a lawyer or swap lawyer for anything else in the social sciences, in the arts, etc., etc. So, if the institutions are trying to divert our attention to form, away from substance, we must try to break the shackles ourselves. How? One example, my own example and my own resistance when it comes to PowerPoint. In an institution that shall remain nameless, I received an email from one of the pen pushers saying that we've gone through the virtual learning environment and we've seen your slides and your slides don't conform with our brand. Why are the slides not branded? I talked to colleagues and I said, what do I do? And a lot of colleagues said, you're not looking for trouble, are you? Conform. And I thought, nah. So I wrote back, well, these slides were done on the dime of another institution. And they have graciously allowed me to use them here. Therefore, that's why they're not branded. It would be wholly inappropriate for me to take slides that might have intellectual property issues from somewhere else and then try to flog them off as this new institutions. And I waited for the response. None came. And it's not just a case of standing up to the bureaucrats when it comes to slides. Why do we use PowerPoint slides? Should we always use PowerPoint slides? My response is no. There is no one single method fits all when it comes to education. In order to keep the bureaucrats happy, I had the slides up on the virtual learning environment. But At Bloomsbury Institute, for example, because we are at Bloomsbury Institute now today, and I have former students here who are now colleagues in teaching, and they will remember, I said to them, the slides are on the VLE. Don't waste your time with them. If you want to read something, read the textbook. In class, I'm not going to sit down on my backside and read off the slides to you lot. So your attention is going to be on what I'm saying. And it was a two-way classroom. And I don't think it went all that badly because there weren't any student complaints against me. There may have been other types of complaints, but I certainly didn't have any student complaints. So, if the institution is attacking your identity as an educator by forcing you to comply with a one-method-fits-all, stand up. Resist as far as you can. The irrational focus on the essay, it happens in law a lot. Other subjects probably not. But why? When you want to stand up and you say, no, we don't want to assess students on a single essay. We have to examine them. But it's too much hassle. But the students don't like examinations. Well, tough. Students must be examined. We have a responsibility to these students' future clients when they're out peddling their trade to ensure that they know their trade. And you can't be sure they know their trade when you give them an essay subject at the start of term and the student knows that this is all I need to focus on to pass, even if I go and do the research myself and write my own essay and I don't purchase it from some essay mill. So these are issues that we need to stand up for as educators. If we don't, then the bureaucrats and the pen pushers are going to impose this form, this abnormal, irrational form of one-size-fits-all assessment onto us. Moving on to more substantive issues in teaching public law or teaching constitutional law. The textbooks normally would deal with the monarchy, for example. They would deal with the concept of parliamentary democracy. Here in the UK, we are lucky to live in a country which has the mother of all parliaments in the world in it, a great parliamentary democratic system. It's our parliament which is sovereign. That's what the textbooks would tell you. That's what a lot of law teachers might tell you. But they're not telling you the whole story. And your students deserve to know the whole story. Your students deserve to know that Queen Elizabeth herself in her person costs the English taxpayer £348 million a year. And this is just Queen Elizabeth the person. Philip had his own extra income. Charles has his, so does Charles's older son, and so do others in the inner circle of the royal family. Who pays for this? Me and you pay for this. The taxpayer pays for this. The 20% VAT that we have to pay on food that we buy or anything else that we buy helps to fund this. I wouldn't mind if it helped fund housing and education and healthcare and other things that it's meant to fund, but it needs to fund the Queen first. How many textbooks tell the students that they have to think about, should this 348 million be spent on ensuring children don't go to bed hungry at night and aren't sent to school the next morning hungry and therefore collapse in school, rather than it being spent on the Queen's corgis and the Queen's horses, who perhaps never miss a meal and who perhaps have better nutrition than a lot of children living in this United Kingdom of ours. These are things the students need to know. They might end up by saying, okay, teacher, you're wrong, I'm still a monarchist. That's fine. But give them the other side of the story too. Parliamentary democracy is not democracy. The first past the post system that we have is not a democratic system. It means the candidate that has more votes than the runner-up goes into Parliament, even if the vast majority of voters in a particular constituency do not vote for that candidate. Do the textbooks teach this? No, they don't. Then that's our job. If we want to identify ourselves as educators, we need to educate. We should not parrot the textbooks. The myth of parliamentary sovereignty. It's a myth that has been in existence since 1689, when we had a so-called glorious revolution, which wasn't glorious, and it wasn't even a revolution. But the idea of sovereignty today lies with the parliament, not with the monarch anymore. That's another lie. Again, students need to be informed that a Tory Lord Chancellor, Lord Hailsham, back in 1978, when he was still in the opposition, because Maggie Thatcher came into power, unfortunately, in 1979, however much I wish she hadn't, but she did. And Lord Hailsham only became Lord Chancellor a year later in 79. But in 78, he wrote a book saying that the whole idea of parliamentary sovereignty is a sham, it's an elective dictatorship. And this is coming from the Tories, not the revolutionary leftists. It's an elective dictatorship. Why? Because we voters go and we elect whoever we think is in line with our ideals for the future of our society. But because the system is rigged, it's first past the post, the person who goes in owes his allegiance to the political party that's in power. Because to be the political party in power, you have to be the party that controls most of the seats in the Commons. Therefore, a political party that does not have at least 50% of the vote of voters will be running the country. And they will be steamrolling through what they want to steamroll through, whether the majority of people want that or don't want that. So students should know this. Students studying constitutional law, public law. And again, I'm saying public law because this is what I teach. But I'm sure in any other of the social sciences or in any of the art subjects, there are similar things that educators, if they want to identify themselves as educators, must let their students know, outside of what the textbook says. I don't know how much time I've got left, but I will continue until you tell me to shut up, and that isn't quite shut up yet. So, again, the textbooks will talk about a judiciary which happens to be independent, but it's not. The judiciary never has been independent. And even today, when there is a so-called outside of government method of appointing judges, it is still not independent. The judiciary to this day remains subservient to the establishment. Now, can I prove this? If I can't prove it, I'm talking nonsense. But we have case law that shows this. Cases that ultimately end up with decisions that are political, not decisions that are based in law. Cases where you see the High Court at first instance has judged according to the law. On appeal, the Court of Appeal has judged according to the law. Once it makes its way to what was the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords and today the Supreme Court, law gets set aside and the judgments of the lower courts is overturned and a politically acceptable decision takes the place. And there are examples that I don't have time, so I can't tell you what they are. If I had time, I would have. The Human Rights Act. It's being sold to everybody as the best thing since sliced bread. That's what the textbooks tell you, but is it the truth? No, it's not. We are told that the Human Rights Act came here to bring home all of the rights that we should cherish that exist in the European Convention on Human Rights. But they don't. Article 13 of the European Convention on Human Rights says what? You have a right to a suitable and just remedy. The wording is effective remedy. The Human Rights Act purposefully set that aside. Why? Because citizens of the United Kingdom do not have a right to an effective remedy. If our human rights have been abused, our fundamental rights have been abused by the state, English courts cannot give us an effective remedy because the Human Rights Act doesn't allow it. They have to fudge their way through it. And Section 6 of the Act says what? Very Orwellian. Section 6 of the Act. It starts off really nicely. The state has to abide by human rights standards. Great. But then it goes on to say, except when the state doesn't want to. But it can't say this openly. It has to go around it in a roundabout way. So the state has to abide by human rights standards. For the purpose of the Human Rights Act, the state is just the executive and just the judiciary. So not the Parliament. So Parliament can pass legislation that conflicts directly with your fundamental rights. Human Rights Act says Parliament can. So what happens is that you want to challenge a decision of a public body, a public authority, the government, who've abused your fundamental rights. What the government will say is, we're just following the Act of Parliament. Parliament instructed us to do this. This is the Act of Parliament, this is what we're instructed to do, so we haven't broken the law. So in a roundabout way, the state has to abide by the Human Rights Act, except for when the state doesn't want to. When you create an exception for the Parliament, and the Parliament legislates contrary to human rights, the government has to impose legislation. That's its job. So these are issues that students need to know. Rule of law, I have to miss out. What do? We resist. There's no other choice. Otherwise, we're not doing our students a service. How do we resist? In my classes, I talk about Karl Marx. I say he was wrong about economics, and he was certainly wrong about human nature. But when it came to the institution of the law, absolutely right. The law is made and the law exists to serve the interests of the owners of means of production, of the owners of power. Back in Marx's day, the people who owned land, the people who owned the factories. Today, the people who own the shares and the stocks, etc., etc. Teach our students not to be what Malcolm X would call house Negroes. Tell them that you don't need to be somebody who is more worried about the master, about what's going to happen to the master's house. Tell them that you identify yourself as their teacher with the field Negroes, the people out in the field who don't get the scraps from the master's table, who have to work their backsides off in rain and snow, etc., etc., etc. And you hope for the collapse of an unfair and unjust system, and you're certainly not going to actively and proactively help promote its continuation. These are the kinds of things I believe that an educator who wants to identify himself as an educator rather than somebody just training a plumber, etc., etc., needs to do. Solzhenitsyn in his cancer ward says, burden kids with the truth. Burden your students with the truth. If the truth isn't in the textbook, so be it. If the truth isn't what your institution wants you to say, and your institution hauls you in to say, why don't you just stick to the textbook as I've been hauled in before? I won't say where, but I have been. Well, if the students wanted to read the textbook, they wouldn't be paying you £9,250 a year to read the textbook. They're paying this money because they want to hear something over and above it. Colleagues say to me, it's not worth it. Students don't even care. They don't even understand. Back off. Look after yourself. Why bother? And my response is 99.9% of students might not care. But the one student in each cohort who does care is the one that you need to stand up for. I received an email from one student a while ago containing the quote that you see down here. And the email came out of the blue. I taught the student on one module only, gone, moved on, didn't think again. And after a long while, something came into my inbox, and it said, if you've ever wondered if you've made a difference in your students' lives, you've made a difference in mine, and I'm grateful for it. So, it is worth it. Resistance is worth it, standing up is worth it, trying to maintain the stance of an educator against the pen pushers, against the bureaucracy, is what we should do. And if we're not, I think we're not doing our students a favor. I've talked far too much, sorry. Okay, thanks everyone.
Do we have any questions on? Yes.
Okay, thank you. It was really nice to have a little input on public law as well. It did get the blood racing a bit. I just wanted to, the vibe that keeps coming through to me is this whole idea of game changers. And we've thought about identity. It's making me think as an academic. We see what goes on with our society. If I'm honest, it's not that I'm defeatist, but sometimes these discussions about BAME and the labeling, I see it as a bit of a game. If I'm honest with you, I think the class system has worked very well for certain individuals in the UK. It's not an accident. It might not be how you and I want life to be, but for some people, the system is serving them extremely well. So I think we shouldn't play games about that. It's not in some people's interest to change things. However, it doesn't mean that they can't change. And I think we should focus on what are the things that can make a difference. For example, something that came to me is this idea of enterprise. And when you create an alternative. Now, maybe it's because we've got a few Nigerians in the room. One thing that's come to mind for me is the whole idea of Nollywood as an industry, and I find that that's like the Nigeria's response to Hollywood. And we've all seen the rise in this whole idea of Nigerian movies. And I thought to myself, many of those individuals who have become producers, directors, actors, big household names, if they were waiting on Hollywood to be more diverse and give them a chance, because if I followed Hollywood, I would think there were maybe about 10 individuals from certain backgrounds who could act. You know, they seem to be in every film. But people have said, you know what, no problem. You don't want to open a door for us? We're going to open up our own doors. And I think it's for us. For example, where's Cordelia? I got excited about this idea about music. And now, if we're trying to rival a Russell group, it could be maybe difficult. But if we come up with something special and innovative and start to really capture this idea of how we can impact the brain and use music, and we start to create something new, becoming game changers, the radio station we've got, I think there's potential for a lot we can do, using things that might be seen as a disadvantage. And I think if we get some heads together and start thinking, what are our USPs? How can we offer an alternative instead of trying to beg people to open doors or try to rival people at what they've already built and entrenched to keep other people out. So I want to ask you, as a radical public law person, what scope do you think there is for us taking an approach where we create a sophisticated revolution of innovation?
Well, the issue is that, A, I agree with everything that you said. B, each of us has to use the tools that they have in their hands. I'm not a business person, so I wouldn't be the best person to talk about innovation. I wouldn't be the best person to talk about alternatives to Hollywood. However, the tools that I do have in my hands are the theoretical tools of telling students not to believe everything that A, the textbook tells them, B, what their tutor tells them. So if I go off in a class on a rant against the monarchy, I will want the students to challenge me in my rant against the monarchy, to come up with, but the monarchy's great for the economy because the monarchy rakes in money from tourists who come to the UK to see Buckingham Palace and see the Queen. And that would allow me to respond to say, well, the French don't have a monarch because they decided to do what they needed to do in 1789. And France has more tourists than the United Kingdom does, foreign tourism, in terms of A, quantity, and B, quantitatively, in terms of income from tourism, income of France is much more than the income of the UK. So perhaps the Eiffel Tower is worth more than Buckingham Palace. So refute the concept of it's, for example, great for tourism. You mentioned that society works well for a lot of people. It does. That's why I always bring in Marx. I'm not a Marxist economically. And certainly, you know, he had his head stuck somewhere in his anatomy when he thought that human nature will allow for equality. But when discussing the institution of law, he was right. And it doesn't matter where you are. So this isn't just a critique of neoliberal society. It's a critique of whatever economic system is imposed upon a people, wherever in the world, whatever country they are. The law is going to enforce the interests of the ruling elite, whether it's North Korea, or whether it's here, or whether it's China, or countries X, Y, or Z. So the tools I have are only theoretical tools to allow me to push my students, to push them to think for themselves, not take for granted what the textbook might tell them or what any lecturer might tell them. Because if they see somebody who's a little bit radical and pushing them to question him, they would question the non-radical teachers as well. And it's step by step. Nothing's going to change overnight. It's generation after generation after generation. But this is the little step that I can take. And if I don't take this step, then what am I doing? I shouldn't be here. So it's not a direct answer, but yeah.
And the law, you said you've got theory, but also the law and the power of understanding the law and the power of understanding how to influence the law. These are amazing tools.
Absolutely. So the Human Rights Act, for example, it's not the greatest thing since sliced bread. The Human Rights Act has actually reduced the rights that exist within the Convention, the European Convention on Human Rights itself. And I gave the example of Article 13, and I told you how Section 6 of the Act operates. So it's an act to say we've brought these rights home, but at the same time, in an Orwellian sense, some animals are more equal than others. If it's the establishment, then you back off.
So, Ali, I just have a question about your presentation. So, in your presentation, you actually spoke about the Human Rights Act, 1998. And we know that the UK doesn't have a written constitution. In America, they have the Bill of Rights. So, if we were, let's say, the UK should have a written constitution, and then incorporate the Human Rights Act into that constitution, into articles of that constitution, how would it be different from America's constitution? Because America has a written constitution, and recently a Canadian judge found that America has been breaching human rights. So what would actually be our argument for us to incorporate it and to protect our human rights?
The establishment will always try to get away with what the establishment can get away with. What you need is a strong, independent judiciary to stop the establishment. The judiciary must rely on the law. Having a codified constitution will help. Having a codified constitution isn't a panacea, yeah? But it helps. North Korea has a codified constitution, and it's called the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea. People's, great. Democratic, great. Republic, great. But here I am criticizing the UK system of government, but I'm doing it here in the UK. I'm not willing to go and live in North Korea, yeah, to put my money where my mouth is. And we're not a People's Democratic Republic, are we? We're living under a monarchy. So although having a codified constitution will help, it is not the end of the case. But it does help immensely. In the United States, First Amendment rights, Second Amendment rights, they are protected by the courts. They have almost religious value, the right to bear arms. There's nothing that the state can do about it, even though there might be legitimate reasons to restrict the bearing of arms. The liberty to say what you wish to say, it has almost religious significance in the United States. And the judges will stand up for it, because it's written down in their constitutional order. Without the written constitution in the United Kingdom, all laws being theoretically equal, Parliament can pass any kind of legislation it wishes, which would be contradicting previous legislation and allowing the government to abuse rights. That's the problem we have. A written constitution is immensely helpful, but it's not the final solution. The final solution is having judges who stand up for the law and the people, rather than standing up for the interests of the establishment, as they did during the Brexit issue. Now, many people here might be pro-EU, might think Brexit was a bad idea. Maybe it was. Maybe the British people decided to shoot themselves in the foot by voting for Brexit in the referendum. But it was the people's choice. And when it's the people's choice, it's the people's choice. And you go with it. You can't say that we gave the opportunity to the nation to choose, and they made the wrong choice, so we're going to do everything that we can, and we're going to manipulate everything to try to stop this choice happening. And that's what the Supreme Court did. We have to be realistic. They forgot the law, and they took a political position that served the interests of the establishment. So these are realities we need to deal with, and these are things we need to tell our students. Otherwise, we're not doing them a favour. We're not telling them anything more than the BBC is telling them. What's the point of teaching law?
So in the last 24 months, I've had students come into my class, physically when, of course, we were physical, and virtually when it's been virtual. And they've come in from a demonstration. Okay? So they were out protesting in the streets about the Extinction Rebellion on climate change. Yeah. Or last summer, they were out protesting on the streets because of Black Lives Matter. And then they came into the classroom. And then you have that's part of the picture. The other part of the picture is 24 hours ago, some of us were there in the other teaching and learning conference, Anna, the other show in town this week, which is the sector's sort of flagship event from Advanced HE. Yeah? And there was a signature moment in this 3-day event, and I was there for large chunks of it. And I won't name the higher education institution, John, but I'll just say they were a University of London college. I'll just leave it at that. And they put up, this head of careers there said, there are 3 things that we ask our students. And it was all about me, me, me. All about making money. I'm paraphrasing. And I asked a question, I said, what about society? What about community? Doesn't that matter? Shouldn't we be also talking about that in terms of, and then, you know, it was a bit of defensive response to that. But my question is about this. It's about the students, actually. The students are ahead of the curve here. They get it. They're driving it. The debates around sustainability, they're way ahead of most universities in terms of their focus on that area. Issues around race, absolutely ahead of most universities in that area, as we've been hearing. So my question is, what do we do about it? Around collaboration, the C word, yeah? And my question to you is, having painted that picture of disruption, how do we work more effectively with students within our institution and outside of our institution, within our sector at a national level, to ensure that we can get that fuel from the students to drive change in our sector? Because what I worry, John, most about of all is that our sector is moving at a glacial pace in some of these issues. There are some that are moving with it, some who are fighting that chain, that resistance. But if we can tap into the student push in this direction, we'll be in a better place. So I'd be interested in your thoughts around, really what I'm asking about is strategies for collaboration to address what you've highlighted.
An interesting question to which I don't have a full answer at the moment. But what I can say, the reality is that students tend to be far less idealistic after they've graduated. Because after graduation, the reality of life hits, and hits hard. You need the job because you have to pay interest at usurious rates on your student loan. The Bank of England base rate now is, I think, 0.1%. But the students have to repay on 6 point something. So 100% of 0.1 would be 0.2. 200% of it would be 0.3. How many thousands of percentage points above is the usurious rate students have to pay? Now, 2,000 years ago, a chap called Jesus went into the temple and overturned the tables of the moneylenders. So perhaps this is what we've got to tell our students to think about doing once they graduate. However, this should always come with the warning that it's breaking the law. As long as enough of you are breaking it, it's fine. But there needs to be enough of you. if you don't have that critical mass, you're going to find yourself in trouble. And one or two canny students might put their hands up at this stage. And we say to them, well, you're mostly young guys, and you can't remember the days of the poll tax. But those who do remember the days of the poll tax, when Maggie Thatcher, the milk snatcher, and I've mentioned her name twice now today, unfortunately, so you will forgive me, decided to impose the poll tax on just about everybody. And what did the people do? The people rebelled. And they rebelled in numbers significant enough to create a critical mass, to break the law, to march when they weren't meant to march, and to burn when they weren't meant to burn. And of course, we can't formally condone such behavior. But when it's the last resort, you do what you need to do to get rid of the poll tax. And the people did it. And the poll tax didn't come into being. So this is what we can tell students. But I need to think about what you said as well, because it's an interesting comment, and I need to formulate my thoughts around it. Thank you. Yeah.